The doors of the great hall opened with a sound like thunder, and Alira Vance walked through them alone. Every torch in the hall burned high that night, throwing orange light across stone walls, stained dark with age. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her. Warriors, nobles, guards with hands resting on blades, and at the far end, seated on a throne carved from black wood, sat the man who held the fate of her entire pack in his hands. King Draven Ashford, the Alpha King. He did not rise when she entered. He did not speak. He simply watched her cross the long stretch of stone floor, his eyes following every step, every breath, every flicker of fear she refused to let show on her face. Alira had one night, one single night to convince this man not to destroy everything she loved. And she could not speak a single word. Not because she chose silence as a strategy, not because she was holding back some clever plan. She could not speak because 7 years ago, sickness had taken her voice and never given it back. The healers said her throat had simply stopped working the way it should. No sound could pass through it, not even a whisper. Her people called it a curse. Some called it a blessing, since she had never once said a cruel word to anyone in 7 years. But tonight, walking toward the most powerful man in the kingdom, it felt like neither. It felt like a wall between her and the only thing that could save her family. The war between her pack and King Draven's forces had been building for almost a year. It started with a border dispute, a strip of land that both sides claimed as their own. Then came accusations of stolen livestock, poisoned wells, and finally, 3 nights ago, an attack on a border patrol that left 2 of the king's men wounded. The king's response had been swift and merciless. He gathered his army at the edge of Ashwood territory, ready to burn every home to the ground unless someone came forward to answer for what had happened. Alira's father, the pack's beta, had been ready to go himself. He was the one who negotiated treaties, who spoke for the pack in matters like this. But he had been injured in the very attack that started this crisis, his leg broken in 2 places, unable to travel, let alone stand before a king and plead for mercy. The elders argued for hours about who should go in his place. Names were suggested and rejected one after another. No one wanted to face King Draven. His reputation stretched across the entire Western territories. They called him ruthless. They called him a man who had taken his throne through combat, defeating even his own father in a challenge that left the old king dead on the training grounds. They said Draven Ashford felt nothing when he looked at his enemies. That mercy was a word he had erased from his vocabulary the day he claimed his crown. Alira had listened to all of this from the back of the meeting hall, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. And when the room fell silent, when no one stepped forward, she rose from her seat. She could not speak, but she could write. She could use her hands, her eyes, her presence. She had spent her whole life learning to communicate without a voice, finding ways to make people understand her even when words failed. If anyone in this pack could face a man who valued silence and control, perhaps it was her. Her father argued against it from his sickbed, his voice cracking with worry. Her mother had passed 3 years earlier, and Alira was all he had left. He could not bear the thought of sending his only daughter into the den of a man known for cruelty. But Alira was firm. She wrote her decision on a piece of parchment and placed it in her father's hands. I am going. Someone has to. And I am the only one who is not afraid to stand in silence. That last part was not entirely true. She was afraid. She had never been more afraid in her life. But fear had never stopped her from doing what needed to be done, and it would not stop her now. She left before dawn the next morning, carrying only a satchel with a few of her father's old journals, some parchment and ink, and a small wooden carving her mother had made for her years ago, shaped like a bird with its wings spread wide. Her mother used to say that even without a voice, Alira could still fly. The journey to the Alpha King's stronghold took 2 full days. She traveled through forests that had once been peaceful and were now scarred by patrol lines and watchtowers. She passed abandoned farms where families had fled the growing conflict, doors left open, fields left unharvested. The sight of it settled heavy in her chest. This was what war did. It emptied places that used to be full of life. By the time she reached the edge of King Draven's territory, the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and violet. The black citadel rose ahead of her, its towers cutting into the darkening sky like blades. She had heard stories about this place her whole life, but nothing prepared her for how it actually felt to stand before it. The stone walls seemed to absorb the last light of the day, leaving the entire fortress wrapped in shadow, even before night fully fell. 2 guards stood at the gate, spears crossed in front of her path. They looked at her with suspicion, taking in her travel-worn cloak, the satchel over her shoulder, the calm but tired look on her face. "State your business," one of them said, his voice hard. Alira reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. It was the formal message the king's envoy had delivered to her pack 3 days earlier, the one that promised safe passage for a single representative who wished to speak with the king before the war began in earnest. The guard took the parchment, read it, and looked back at her with a frown. "You're the representative from Ashwood Pack?" She nodded. "Where's your beta, your alpha? Why send a girl who can't even open her mouth to answer me?" Alira did not flinch. She simply held his gaze, steady and calm, and waited. The second guard laughed, a short, ugly sound. "She's mute. Guess Ashwood really is desperate if they're sending someone who can't even beg properly." Alira felt the sting of his words, but she did not let it show. She had faced worse than mockery in her life. She had faced years of people assuming that because she could not speak, she could not think, could not feel, could not fight for what mattered to her. She had proven them wrong before. She would prove them wrong again. She simply pointed at the parchment, then at the gate, then folded her hands and waited with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that impatience solved nothing. The first guard sighed and waved her through. "Fine. Let the king deal with her. Not my problem anymore." The gates opened with a heavy groan, and Alira stepped into the courtyard of the Black Citadel, her heart pounding harder with every step. Torches lined the stone pathway leading to the main hall. Soldiers moved in the distance, some training, some simply watching her with curious eyes as she passed. She kept her chin lifted, her shoulders straight, refusing to let anyone see how much her legs wanted to shake. A servant met her near the entrance to the main hall, a young woman with kind eyes, who seemed surprised to see someone so young and so alone standing before her. "You're here to see the king?" the servant asked gently. Alira nodded and held up the parchment again. "He's expecting the Ashwood representative tonight. Come with me, but be warned. He has not been in a forgiving mood these past weeks. Whatever you plan to say to him, you should choose your words carefully." Alira almost laughed at that, though no sound would have come out even if she tried. Choosing her words carefully was not something she needed to worry about. She had no words to choose. What she had instead was everything she had prepared over the last 2 days of travel, folded carefully in her satchel, waiting for the moment she would need it most. The servant led her through corridors lined with old tapestries, depicting past battles and long-dead kings. The Black Citadel felt colder inside than out, as if the stone itself remembered every hard decision made within its walls. Alira tried not to think about what decisions might be made tonight, about what her failure here would mean for everyone she loved. They reached a set of massive doors at the end of a long corridor. The servant knocked twice, then pushed them open. "The Ashwood representative, Your Majesty," she announced, then stepped aside to let Alira pass. And now here she was, standing in the great hall, walking the long stretch of stone floor, while hundreds of eyes watched her every move, while the Alpha King himself sat perfectly still, on his black wood throne, studying her, as if she were a puzzle he intended to solve before the night was through. Alira stopped a respectful distance from the throne and bowed her head, just enough to show respect without showing weakness. When she lifted her eyes again, she found King Draven watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Not anger. Not yet. Something more like careful calculation, the look of a man deciding how much attention this moment deserved. He was younger than she expected. The stories had painted him as some ancient, weathered warrior, hardened by decades of battle. But the man before her looked to be barely past 30, with dark hair that fell just above sharp eyes, and a build that spoke of years of physical discipline rather than simple brute strength. There was a scar across his left eyebrow, thin and old, the only visible mark on an otherwise unblemished face. "You're the one Ashwood sent," he said finally, his voice low and even, carrying easily across the silent hall. "Where is your beta, your alpha? I was told someone would come to speak on behalf of your pack." Alira reached into her satchel again, retrieving a piece of parchment she had prepared before leaving home. She stepped forward, close enough for one of the guards to intercept her, but Draven raised a hand, and the guard stepped back. She held out the parchment. A servant nearby took it and carried it up to the throne, placing it in the king's hands. He read it slowly. Alira watched his face for any reaction, but he gave nothing away. The parchment explained, in careful handwriting, that her father was injured and unable to travel, that she had come in his place, and that she could not speak due to an illness from years ago, but that she had brought proof and evidence that would explain everything about the conflict between their peoples. When he finished reading, he looked up at her, and for a long moment the hall remained utterly silent. "You cannot speak," he said. It was not quite a question. Alira shook her head. "And yet your pack sent you anyway, to face me, tonight, with everything at stake." She nodded. Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. He set the parchment down on the arm of his throne and leaned forward slightly, studying her with new interest. "Most people who stand where you're standing spend their time begging, making promises, trying every trick they know to convince me not to burn their homes to ash by morning. You have said nothing since you walked through those doors." Alira held his gaze and did not look away. "Do you intend to say anything at all?" She reached into her satchel one final time, pulling out the collection of documents and drawings she had spent the last 2 days preparing, evidence she had gathered from her father's records, from witnesses in her pack, from anything that might explain the truth of what had actually happened along that border. She held them out toward him, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I have no words," her posture seemed to say, "but I have the truth, and I intend to show it to you, piece by piece, until you understand what your soldiers could not." King Draven studied her for a long moment, the entire hall holding its breath around them. Then, slowly, he rose from his throne and descended the steps toward her, closing the distance between them until he stood close enough that she could see the exact shade of gray in his eyes. "Everyone out," he said, his voice carrying easily despite its quiet tone. "Except my advisor. The rest of you, leave us." The hall emptied in a rush of movement, boots against stone, doors closing one after another until it was only Alira, the king, and a silver-haired man standing near the throne, who watched her with sharp, careful eyes. King Draven looked down at the documents in her hands, then back up at her face. "Show me," he said. "Show me everything." And Alira, still without a single word, began. Alira laid the first document on the small table the silver-haired advisor brought forward, smoothing the parchment flat with careful hands. It was a map, hand-drawn by her father years ago, showing the disputed border between Ashwood territory and the king's lands, exactly as it had been marked in the original treaty, signed 2 generations earlier. King Draven leaned over the table, studying the lines with narrowed eyes. "This matches the old records," he said, more to his advisor than to her. "Continue." She placed a second document beside the first. This one was newer, drawn only months ago, showing the same border, but with several key markers moved, shifted deeper, into what had always been recognized as Ashwood land. She pointed to the difference between the 2 maps, then tapped her finger firmly on the newer one. The advisor, a man named Corwin who had served the Ashford family for over 20 years, stepped closer to examine the documents himself. "Your Majesty, if this is accurate, someone altered the boundary markers without authorization." "Who drew this second map?" Draven asked, looking at Alira directly. She retrieved another paper from her satchel, this one a written account from one of the pack's oldest hunters, a man who had witnessed the border markers being moved under cover of darkness 3 months earlier. The account named no names, since the hunter had been too far away and too afraid to approach, but it described the uniforms worn by the men doing the work, uniforms that matched the king's own border patrol. Draven read the account twice, his jaw tightening with each line. "You're telling me my own men moved the markers themselves?" Alira nodded, then held up a hand, asking for patience. She was not finished. She laid out a third piece of evidence, a ledger showing livestock counts from Ashwood's herds over the past year. Beside it, she placed a second ledger, one that recorded strange losses, beginning exactly around the time the border markers had shifted, cattle disappearing in small numbers, always near the newly claimed territory, always blamed on wolves from her own pack, despite the fact that Ashwood hunters tracked no wolf activity in that area during those months. You're saying the livestock losses that started this entire conflict were staged, Draven said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. She nodded again, more firmly this time. Corwin frowned, stepping forward to examine the ledgers himself. Your Majesty, this would mean someone deliberately provoked the conflict between our territories, someone with access to border patrol uniforms and knowledge of livestock movement patterns. Someone within my own command structure, Draven finished, his voice hardening into something colder and more dangerous than anything Alira had heard from him yet. She reached for her final piece of evidence, the most damaging of everything she carried. It was a letter. One of her father's most trusted contacts had intercepted from a merchant caravan traveling through the border region. The letter had been addressed to Commander Ashgrove, the officer who oversaw the entire Eastern Border Patrol, the very man responsible for enforcing the treaty between their peoples. The letter spoke in coded language, but the meaning was clear enough to anyone who understood military communication. It referenced payments received, land acquired, and a promise that once the Ashwood territory changed hands, certain parties would be rewarded generously for their cooperation. Draven took the letter from her hands himself this time, reading it slowly, his expression darkening with every word. When he finished, he set it down on the table with more force than necessary, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent hall. Ashgrove, he said, the name coming out like a curse. He's been feeding me reports for months. Reports about Ashwood aggression. Reports about stolen cattle and violated boundaries. I trusted every word of it. Alira watched him carefully, searching his face for any sign of doubt, any suggestion that he might dismiss her evidence as forgery or manipulation. Instead, she saw something she had not expected. She saw genuine anger, but not directed at her or her pack. It was directed inward, at himself, at the trust he had placed in a man who had clearly betrayed him for personal gain. Why would he do this? Draven muttered, though the question seemed aimed more at the empty air than at anyone in the room. What could possibly be worth starting a war? Corwin cleared his throat carefully. Your Majesty, if I may, Commander Ashgrove has always shown interest in expanding his personal holdings. If Ashwood territory came under Crown control following a successful campaign, and if he were the officer who led that campaign, the king's gratitude might have included land grants. Substantial ones. Draven's hands curled into fists at his sides. He was willing to send soldiers to die, willing to burn an entire pack's homes to the ground, for land he wanted for himself. Alira remained still, letting the weight of the revelation settle over the room. She had not spoken a single word this entire time, and yet somehow, the silence between each piece of evidence had done more to convince him than any speech could have accomplished. Every document had spoken for itself. Every piece of proof had built upon the last, until the truth became impossible to ignore. Draven finally looked up from the table, meeting her eyes directly. How long have you had this evidence? She held up 3 fingers, then mimed the shape of days passing with her hand. 3 days. You gathered all of this in 3 days, after your father was injured, and then traveled here alone to present it to me. She nodded. Why did you not send word ahead? Why not request an audience with written explanation before arriving in person? You could have avoided this journey entirely, avoided standing before me not knowing whether I would even listen. Alira considered this question carefully, before reaching for a fresh piece of parchment and her small pot of ink. She had anticipated this question, or one like it, and had thought carefully about how to answer it during the long hours of her journey. She wrote slowly, choosing her words with the same care she used to choose every gesture, every action that had to speak in place of her voice. Words on paper can be dismissed as lies from a distance, she wrote. A person standing before you cannot be so easily ignored. I needed you to see my face, to see that I was not afraid to come here, even without a voice to defend myself, so that when I showed you the truth, you would understand it came from someone willing to risk everything to bring it to you. Draven read this slowly, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, just enough for Alira to notice the change. That took courage, he said quietly. More courage than most men who stand in this hall possess, and they have full use of their voices to defend themselves if I turn against them. She did not respond to this, unsure of how to accept such an unexpected compliment from a man she had been taught to fear her entire life. Draven turned to Corwin. Summon Commander Ashgrove immediately. I want him standing in this hall before the hour is through." Corwin bowed and hurried from the room, his footsteps echoing down the long corridor until they faded into silence. Draven turned back to Alira, studying her with an expression that had shifted entirely from the cold calculation of earlier. "You came here expecting to plead for mercy. Instead, you exposed a traitor within my own ranks. That is not something I anticipated when this night began." Alira allowed herself a small, cautious breath of relief, though she knew the night was far from over. Exposing the truth about Commander Ashgrove was only the first step. The war had already cost lives on both sides. Soldiers wounded, homes abandoned, trust broken between two peoples who had once lived alongside each other peacefully. Uncovering the source of the conflict did not automatically mean the conflict would end. She gathered her remaining documents and returned them carefully to her satchel, watching Draven as he paced slowly before his throne, clearly working through the implications of what he had just learned. The confident, commanding presence he had shown when she first entered the hall had given way to something more thoughtful, more troubled. If Ashgrove orchestrated this entire conflict for personal gain, Draven said, mostly to himself, then every soldier who fell in these border skirmishes died for nothing more than one man's greed. Every family in your pack who suffered, who lost livestock, who lived in fear of my army marching against them, suffered because of a lie. Alira nodded slowly, watching him carefully. "This changes everything," he continued, stopping his pacing to look directly at her. "But it does not undo what has already happened. 2 of my soldiers were wounded in that attack 3 nights ago. Your pack will need to answer for that, regardless of what started this conflict in the first place." She reached for her parchment again, writing quickly this time. "The attack was not ordered by my pack's leadership. It was carried out by a small group of young hunters who acted without authorization, believing your soldiers intended to seize more of our land after the border markers were moved. They acted out of fear and anger, not out of any command from my father or our alpha." Draven read this, his brow furrowing.
"Where are these hunters now?"
She wrote again, "Under guard in our own territory, awaiting judgment from our pack council. My father intended to bring their punishment before you as part of these negotiations, along with reparations for your wounded soldiers. Your pack was prepared to hand over its own people for punishment," Draven said slowly, as if this fact surprised him more than anything else she had shown him tonight. She nodded firmly. For a long moment, King Draven simply looked at her, and Alira found herself unable to read the emotions moving behind his gray eyes. Then he turned away, walking slowly back toward his throne, though he did not sit. Instead, he stood before it, one hand resting on the black wood armrest, staring at nothing in particular while he thought. "I came into this night prepared to march my army against your pack at first light," he admitted, his voice quieter than before, meant only for her to hear. "I believed every report Ashgrove sent me. I believed your people were the aggressors, that they had violated a treaty my grandfather signed in good faith. I was ready to burn Ashwood to the ground and call it justice." Alira remained silent, watching him, waiting to see where this admission would lead. "And now I discover that the man I trusted most with the security of my borders has been lying to me for months, manufacturing a war for his own profit, while I nearly destroyed an entire pack based on his fabrications." He shook his head slowly. "This is not a mistake I can simply correct with an apology." She reached for her parchment one final time, writing carefully, wanting to make sure her meaning was completely clear. "You cannot undo what has already happened, but you can choose what happens next. That choice matters more than anything that came before it." Draven read this twice before looking up at her, and for the first time since she had entered the Great Hall, something like genuine warmth appeared in his expression, brief and unguarded before he composed himself again. "You came here to persuade me not to destroy your pack," he said. "I think you may have already succeeded, and we have not even reached the difficult part of this conversation yet." Before Alira could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, followed by voices, one of them raised in protest. The doors to the Great Hall swung open, and Corwin returned, followed closely by 2 guards escorting a tall, broad-shouldered man in the king's uniform, his face twisted with confusion and growing alarm. Commander Ashgrove had arrived. Commander Ashgrove stopped a few paces into the hall, his eyes flicking from the king to Alira to the documents still spread across the small table between them. Whatever confusion had been on his face moments earlier sharpened quickly into something more guarded, more calculating. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing stiffly, "I was told you required my presence immediately. Has something happened along the border?" "You could say that," Draven replied, his voice carrying a coldness Alira had not heard from him before, even in the moments when he first learned of the betrayal. "Tell me, Commander, how long have you served as head of the Eastern Border Patrol?" Ashgrove's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the trap forming around him, but unable to see its exact shape yet. 6 years, Your Majesty, since your father's reign. "And in those 6 years, how many border disputes have you reported to me regarding Ashwood Pack?" "Several, Your Majesty. Livestock theft, boundary violations, and most recently, the attack on our patrol that wounded 2 of our men." Draven nodded slowly, walking a slow circle around the table, never taking his eyes off the commander. "And in all that time, did it ever occur to you to question why these violations seem to increase so dramatically over the past several months? Or did you simply assume Ashwood Pack had decided, after generations of peace, to suddenly abandon every treaty their ancestors signed?" Ashgrove's jaw tightened. "I reported what my men observed, Your Majesty. I had no reason to doubt their accounts." "Is that so?" Draven stopped his circling and gestured toward the table. "Then perhaps you can explain this." Corwin stepped forward and gathered the documents, presenting them one by one to the commander. Ashgrove's face remained carefully neutral as he examined the old boundary map, then the newer one showing the shifted markers. But when he reached the account from the Ashwood hunter describing patrol uniforms moving the markers under cover of darkness, something flickered behind his eyes, quick and small, but Alira caught it. She had spent years learning to read faces and bodies, when words were not available to her. She had learned to notice the smallest changes in expression, the tiny shifts that revealed what people tried to hide, and in that brief flicker across Commander Ashgrove's face, she saw guilt. Draven saw it too. "You have nothing to say about the boundary markers, Commander?" "I have no knowledge of any markers being moved, Your Majesty. If this account is accurate, it may have been Ashwood hunters attempting to shift blame onto my men." "A convenient explanation," Draven said. "Let us see if you find the next document equally easy to dismiss." Corwin handed him the ledgers showing the livestock losses, followed by the intercepted letter. Alira watched Ashgrove's composure crack slightly more with each document, his hands beginning to grip the parchment a fraction too tightly, his breathing growing a fraction too fast for a man who claimed complete innocence. When he reached the intercepted letter, the one referencing payments received and land promised in exchange for cooperation, his face went pale. "This is forgery," he said quickly. Too quickly. Anyone could write such a letter and claim it came from legitimate correspondence. "This proves nothing." "Perhaps," Draven said, "except that the merchant caravan that carried this letter has been questioned, and the caravan master confirms it was collected from your personal courier, addressed to a contact in the Southern Territories, known for facilitating illegal land transfers." Ashgrove's face drained of what little color remained. "Your Majesty, I would never betray your trust for personal gain. Whatever this letter suggests, it must be a misunderstanding, a coincidence." "Enough!" Draven's voice cracked through the hall like a whip, silencing the commander instantly. "I have known you for 6 years, Ashgrove. I trusted you with the security of my eastern border, with the lives of every soldier stationed there, and with the fate of an entire pack who has done nothing but honor a treaty their ancestors signed in good faith. And you repaid that trust by manufacturing a war for your own profit. Your Majesty, please. How many soldiers were wounded because of your lies? How many families in Ashwood territory lived in fear these past months because you moved boundary markers and staged livestock losses to provoke a conflict that never needed to happen? Answer me honestly, Ashgrove, or I promise you the consequences will be far worse than anything you currently fear." The commander's shoulders sagged, the last of his composure crumbling under the weight of the evidence laid bare before him. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost all its earlier confidence, replaced by something small and desperate. "The Southern Territories offered a substantial payment for any land I could help transfer away from Ashwood control," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the floor. "They intend to build a trading route through the region, one that would generate significant revenue for years to come. I was promised a portion of that revenue, along with land grants once the territory came under Crown control." So you moved the boundary markers yourself, Draven said, his voice flat and cold. I ordered a small group of trusted men to do so, yes. And I arranged for the livestock disappearances, timed to coincide with the marker movements, so that Ashwood would appear responsible for escalating tensions along the border. And the attack on your own patrol? The one that wounded 2 of your men, and gave you the justification you needed to demand I march my army against Ashwood territory? Ashgrove hesitated, and in that hesitation, Illyra felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had believed, based on her father's information, that the attack 3 nights ago had been carried out by young Ashwood hunters acting rashly out of fear, but something in the commander's silence suggested a different truth might be waiting to surface. The attack was real, Ashgrove finally said. Ashwood hunters did approach our patrol that night, but they did not initiate the confrontation. My men were ordered to provoke them, to push them into a defensive response that could be reported as an unprovoked assault. Illyra felt the room tilt slightly around her. The attack that had nearly cost her pack everything, the incident that had brought King Draven's army to their border ready for war, had been staged from the very beginning. The young hunters who had reacted with force had not started a conflict. They had defended themselves against soldiers deliberately sent to provoke them. She reached for her parchment immediately, writing with hands that trembled slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. The hunters who were involved in that confrontation are currently held under guard by my pack council, awaiting judgment for what we believed was an unprovoked attack on your soldiers. If what he says is true, they acted only in self-defense against men sent deliberately to provoke them. Draven read this, his expression darkening further as the full scope of Ashgrove's betrayal became clear. Your hunters were defending themselves against soldiers acting under my commander's orders, provoked into a confrontation designed specifically to justify a war that would have destroyed your entire pack. She nodded, watching him carefully, waiting to see how this new revelation would shift the balance of everything that had happened tonight. Draven turned back to Ashgrove, and the fury in his expression was unlike anything Illyra had witnessed from him before. You sent my own soldiers into danger, allowed them to be wounded, all so you could manufacture justification for a war that would have killed hundreds, maybe thousands, of innocent people on both sides. All for money and land you did not need and had no right to claim. Your Majesty, I can explain. You have explained quite enough for tonight. Draven's voice cut through the hall with finality. Guards, take Commander Ashgrove into custody. He will face formal judgment before the full council for treason against the crown, for the deliberate provocation of armed conflict, and for the wounding of soldiers under his own command through calculated deception. The guards moved forward immediately, taking hold of Ashgrove's arms despite his continued protests. He struggled briefly, his eyes wild with the sudden realization that everything he had built through years of careful manipulation had collapsed in the span of a single conversation. You would take the word of a mute girl from a pack of border wolves over 6 years of loyal service. Ashgrove spat as the guards began pulling him toward the door. I have served this crown faithfully. You have served your own greed, Draven interrupted, his voice like ice. And tonight, that girl who cannot speak has shown me more truth in a single hour than you managed to hide behind 6 years of carefully constructed lies. Take him away. The guards dragged Ashgrove from the hall, his protests fading into the corridors beyond, until the great doors closed once more, leaving Illyra alone, with King Draven and Corwin, in the sudden heavy silence that followed. For a long moment, no one spoke. Draven stood staring at the closed doors, his hands clenched at his sides, his breathing slow and controlled despite the obvious anger still radiating from him. 6 years, he said finally, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. 6 years I trusted that man with the security of my eastern territories, and this entire time, he was manufacturing conflicts for his own profit, willing to sacrifice soldiers and innocent lives alike to line his own pockets. Corwin cleared his throat gently. Your Majesty, if I may, this discovery, painful as it is, has likely prevented a far greater tragedy. Had this young woman not brought her evidence forward tonight, the war would have proceeded as planned by morning. Countless lives would have been lost on both sides, all because of one man's greed. Draven nodded slowly, finally turning away from the doors to look at Illyra once more. His expression had shifted again, the cold fury replaced by something more complex, something that mixed exhaustion with a grudging respect that seemed to surprise even him. "You saved more lives tonight than you likely realize," he said quietly. "Not just your own pack's lives, but the lives of my soldiers as well. Men who would have marched into battle believing they fought for justice, when in truth they would have died for one commander's personal profit." Alira lowered her eyes briefly, uncertain how to respond to such acknowledgement. She had come here tonight hoping only to save her pack, to prevent the destruction that had loomed over her people for months. She had not expected to uncover a conspiracy that reached into the king's own command structure, nor had she expected to be credited with saving lives beyond her own community. She reached for her parchment once more, though her hand shook slightly as she wrote, the weight of everything that had happened finally beginning to settle over her. "What happens now? To my pack, to the hunters who were only defending themselves, to the treaty between our peoples?" Draven read this carefully, then walked slowly toward the window at the far side of the hall, looking out over the darkened courtyard below, where torches still burned against the night sky. "The treaty will be honored, as it always should have been," he said, his back still turned toward her. "The original boundary lines will be restored, and I will personally see to it that Ashwood territory receives compensation for the livestock losses your pack suffered, along with reparations for the fear and disruption caused by months of manufactured conflict." Alira felt relief wash through her, though she remained cautious, aware that the night was still far from finished. "As for the hunters involved in the confrontation with my patrol," Draven continued, turning back to face her, "if Ashgrove's confession proves accurate, and I have every reason to believe it will, once we investigate further, they acted in self-defense against soldiers, deliberately provoking them. They will not be punished for defending themselves against an unjust attack." She let out a slow breath, some of the tension in her shoulders finally beginning to ease. "But there is more to consider," Draven said, his expression growing thoughtful once more. "Restoring the treaty and providing reparations addresses the immediate conflict. It does not address the deeper questions this night has raised, questions about trust, about how easily manufactured lies nearly destroyed an alliance that has lasted for generations." Alira watched him carefully, sensing that whatever he intended to say next would shape the remainder of this long night in ways she could not yet predict. "I need time to consider how best to move forward," he said finally, "not just in restoring what was broken, but in ensuring something like this cannot happen again. Ashgrove is not the only officer under my command. If he was willing to manufacture a war for personal gain, others might harbor similar ambitions, waiting for their own opportunity." He paused, studying her face for a long moment before continuing. "I would like you to remain here tonight, at the Black Citadel, while I consider the full scope of what needs to be done. Not as a prisoner," he added quickly, seeing something shift in her expression, "but as my guest, so that we might continue this conversation, once I have had time to think through everything you have shown me." Alira hesitated, uncertain about extending her stay in a place she had entered expecting only a single audience, before returning home to deliver news, whether good or terrible, to her waiting pack. But she also understood the wisdom in his request. The night's revelations had been significant, and rushing toward final decisions without proper consideration could lead to mistakes neither of them could afford. She nodded slowly, agreeing to remain. "Good," Draven said, something like relief passing briefly across his features before he composed himself once more. "Corwin will see that you have proper accommodations for the night, along with anything else you might need. Tomorrow, before you return to your pack, we will finalize the terms of the restored treaty, along with whatever additional agreements might help ensure lasting peace between our peoples." Corwin stepped forward, gesturing for Alira to follow him toward a side door leading deeper into the citadel. She gathered her satchel, now considerably lighter without the documents she had carried in, and prepared to follow. But before she could take more than a few steps, King Draven spoke again, his voice quieter now, meant only for her. "Alira." She turned back, surprised to hear him use her name, though she supposed Corwin must have shared it with him at some point during the evening's proceedings. "Thank you," he said simply, "for your courage tonight, for choosing to show me the truth rather than simply hoping I would believe empty words. You have given me a great deal to think about, more than I expected when this night began." She offered him a small, genuine smile, the first she had allowed herself since walking into the great hall hours earlier, then turned to follow Corwin from the room, leaving King Draven alone with his thoughts and the heavy weight of everything the night had revealed. Corwin led Alira through a series of corridors far removed from the great hall, past rooms where servants still moved quietly despite the late hour, tending to duties that never seemed to pause regardless of the crisis unfolding elsewhere in the citadel. The stone walls here felt less imposing than those near the throne room, softened by tapestries in warmer colors and the occasional lit lantern casting gentle light along the passageways. "You will stay in the guest wing tonight," Corwin explained as they walked. "It is reserved for visiting dignitaries and allies, though I admit it has not seen much use in recent months, given the tensions with your pack." Alira glanced at him, curious, despite the exhaustion beginning to settle into her bones after the long day of travel, followed by the intensity of the evening's revelations. "You seem surprised that I speak to you so plainly," Corwin observed, noticing her expression. "I have served King Draven's family for over 2 decades. I watched him grow from a boy who questioned everything to a king who sometimes forgets to question enough. Tonight, you reminded him of something important." She tilted her head slightly, silently asking him to continue. "Trust is dangerous," Corwin said. "The king learned that lesson tonight in the worst possible way, discovering that a man he trusted for 6 years had been deceiving him for personal gain. But distrust is equally dangerous, perhaps more so. A king who trusts no one eventually isolates himself from the very people who could warn him of danger before it arrives. You walked into that hall as a stranger, someone he had every reason to doubt, and yet you gave him something far more valuable than words. You gave him proof, patience, and the courage to face an uncomfortable truth." They reached a set of doors near the end of the corridor, and Corwin pushed them open to reveal a modest but comfortable chamber, complete with a small hearth already crackling with fire, a bed with clean linens, and a writing desk positioned near the window overlooking the citadel's inner courtyard. "This will be your room for the night," he said. "If you need anything, simply ring the bell by the door, and one of the servants will attend to you. Breakfast will be brought to you in the morning, and the king has requested that you join him afterward to discuss the final terms of the treaty." Alira nodded her thanks, stepping into the room and setting her satchel down on the small chair beside the writing desk. Corwin lingered in the doorway a moment longer, watching her with an expression she could not quite interpret. "May I ask you something?" he said finally. She turned to face him, waiting. "Why did you choose silence as your approach tonight? You could have written everything down beforehand, sent it ahead of your arrival, allowed the king time to review it privately before you ever set foot in that hall. Instead, you chose to stand before him and let each piece of evidence unfold slowly, in person. Why?" Alira considered the question carefully, then moved to the writing desk, retrieving a fresh sheet of parchment and her small pot of ink from her satchel. She wrote slowly, wanting her answer to capture the full truth of her reasoning. Words sent from a distance can be dismissed, forgotten, or simply not read at all if the recipient decides the matter unimportant. But a person standing before you, offering proof piece by piece, forces you to engage with each fact individually, rather than dismissing the whole argument at once. I wanted King Draven to arrive at the truth himself, through his own careful examination, rather than simply being told what to believe. People trust conclusions they reach on their own, far more than conclusions handed to them by others. Corwin read this over her shoulder, then nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the thoughtfulness behind her strategy. "That is remarkably wise for someone so young." She offered a small shrug, then wrote a bit more. "I have spent years learning to communicate without a voice. It taught me that how information is presented matters as much as the information itself. People listen differently when they feel they are discovering truth, rather than being told it. A lesson many kings could benefit from learning," Corwin said with a slight smile. "Get some rest tonight, Alira. Tomorrow will bring important conversations, and you will want your strength for whatever comes next." He bowed slightly, then withdrew from the room, closing the door softly behind him, and leaving Alira alone, with the crackling fire and the quiet weight of everything the night had revealed. She moved to the window, looking out over the courtyard below, where a few guards still patrolled despite the late hour, their torches casting small pools of light across the dark stone. Somewhere beyond these walls, her father waited for news, likely unable to sleep despite his injuries, worrying about whether his daughter had succeeded, or whether tomorrow would bring the destruction of everything their pack had built over generations. She wished, not for the first time in her life, that she could simply send word to ease his worry, a quick message explaining that the immediate danger had passed, that the truth had come to light, that King Draven had shown himself to be a man capable of recognizing injustice, even when it came wrapped in 6 years of trusted service. But such messages would have to wait until morning, when proper arrangements could be made to send word back to Ashwood territory. For now, she allowed herself a moment to simply breathe, to feel the exhaustion of the day settle over her, mixed with a cautious relief that the worst outcome, the destruction of her pack and everyone she loved, had been avoided. But relief was not the same as certainty. King Draven had spoken of restoring the treaty, of providing reparations, of ensuring lasting peace between their peoples. Yet he had also spoken of needing time to consider the full scope of what needed to be done, hinting at complications beyond the immediate crisis of Ashgrove's betrayal. Illyra could not shake the feeling that tomorrow's conversation would bring challenges she had not yet anticipated. She changed into simpler clothing, provided in the room's small wardrobe, extinguished the lantern beside her bed, and lay down beneath the clean linens, staring up at the stone ceiling above her, while sleep slowly claimed her exhausted body. Her dreams that night were filled with fragmented images. Her father's worried face, the cold gray eyes of King Draven watching her cross the great hall, the wooden bird carving her mother had made, its wings spread as if ready for flight, and somewhere beneath all of it, a quiet, persistent worry that the peace she had fought so hard to secure tonight might prove more fragile than she hoped. She woke the next morning to soft knocking at her door, followed by a young servant entering with a tray of breakfast, fresh bread, fruit, and a warm cup of tea that filled the room with a pleasant, calming aroma. "Good morning," the servant said cheerfully, setting the tray down on the small table near the window. "The king has requested that you join him in his private study once you have finished eating. Take your time, there is no rush." Illyra thanked her with a small nod, then sat down to eat, grateful for the nourishment after the long, emotionally exhausting day before. As she ate, she found herself thinking about the conversation that awaited her, wondering what complications King Draven had hinted at the previous night, wondering whether the peace she had secured would prove as solid as she hoped. When she finished her meal, she gathered herself carefully, straightening her travel-worn dress as best she could, and running her fingers through her hair to smooth away the tangles of sleep. She retrieved her satchel, now containing only her father's journals, her writing materials, and the small wooden bird her mother had carved, and made her way toward the door, ready to face whatever the day might bring. A different servant waited in the corridor to guide her, leading her through unfamiliar passageways deeper into the citadel until they reached a smaller, more intimate room than the great hall she had stood in the previous night. This space felt less formal, lined with shelves of books and maps, a large wooden desk positioned near a window that let in generous morning light, and a comfortable seating area near a modest hearth. King Draven stood near the window when she entered, his back to the door, seemingly lost in thought as he stared out over the citadel grounds. He turned when he heard her approach, and Illyra noticed immediately that he looked as though he had not slept well, dark circles beginning to form beneath his eyes, his expression carrying the weight of decisions that had clearly occupied him through much of the night. "Illyra," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat in one of the chairs near the hearth. "Thank you for joining me. I hope you slept reasonably well, given the circumstances." She nodded, taking the offered seat while he settled into the chair across from her, studying her for a long moment before speaking again. "I spent much of the night considering everything that happened yesterday evening," he began. "The betrayal within my own command structure, the evidence you brought forward, the fact that my army stood ready to march against your pack based entirely on manufactured lies. It is a great deal to process, even for someone accustomed to difficult decisions." Illyra waited patiently, sensing that he had more to say, and that interrupting, even if she could have, would serve no purpose. "Restoring the treaty, and providing reparations, addresses the immediate injustice," he continued. "But I find myself troubled by a larger question that Ashgrove's betrayal has raised. If one commander was willing to manufacture an entire war for personal profit, how many others within my ranks might harbor similar temptations, waiting for opportunities I have not yet discovered. She reached for her parchment, writing a brief question. What do you intend to do about that concern? That is precisely what I have been considering, he said, standing and moving toward his desk, retrieving a rolled document that he brought back to show her. I intend to conduct a full review of every border commander currently serving under my authority, examining their reports, their decisions, and their personal finances for any signs of similar corruption. It will take time, but it is necessary if I wish to prevent something like this from happening again. Elira nodded, understanding the wisdom in such caution, though she wondered what this meant for the immediate situation regarding her own pack. But there is something else, Draven continued, his expression growing more serious. Word of Ashgrove's arrest has already begun spreading through the Citadel, and by tonight, it will likely reach the other alphas and territorial leaders who answer to my authority. Some of them may see this as an opportunity. She frowned slightly, uncertain what he meant. Ashgrove was not without allies, he explained. Men who benefited from his schemes, or who simply respected his position within my command structure. When they learned that his arrest came about because of evidence brought forward by an Ashwood representative, some may view the restoration of your treaty as weakness on my part, an indication that I can be manipulated by clever presentations, rather than firm judgment. Elira felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the hearth nearby. She had believed, perhaps naively, that uncovering the truth about Ashgrove's betrayal would resolve the conflict entirely. She had not considered that political complications might arise from the very revelation that had saved her pack. She wrote quickly, her hand moving with urgency. What does this mean for the treaty? For my pack's safety? Draven met her eyes, and she saw genuine concern there, mixed with the careful calculation of a ruler, weighing difficult political realities. It means, he said slowly, that restoring peace between our peoples will require more than simply announcing that Ashgrove lied. I will need to demonstrate, clearly and publicly, that this decision comes from justice and wisdom, not from being persuaded by a young woman with compelling documents. Otherwise, I risk appearing weak to those who already question my authority, and that weakness could invite challenges from ambitious alphas who might see this moment as opportunity rather than resolution. Elira sat back slightly, the full weight of the situation settling over her. She had come to the Black Citadel expecting a single night of pleading, a single conversation that would determine her pack's fate one way or another. She had not anticipated that saving her people might require navigating complex political currents that extended far beyond the simple truth she had presented the previous night. I do not say this to frighten you, Draven added, noticing her expression. I say it because I believe you deserve to understand the full complexity of what we face, rather than simply being told that everything has been resolved when significant challenges remain ahead of us. She appreciated his honesty, even as it complicated the relief she had allowed herself to feel that morning. She reached for her parchment once more, determined to understand exactly what challenges lay ahead so that she might help navigate them as effectively as she had navigated the revelations of the previous night. What do you need from me? How can I help ensure this peace holds, not just for tonight, but permanently? King Draven studied her question for a long moment, then looked up at her with an expression that mixed respect with something Elira could not quite name, something that felt almost like hope in the midst of political uncertainty. I think, he said slowly, that you and I need to have a much longer conversation than either of us anticipated when this night began. Draven set the rolled document down on the small table between them and moved to the window once more, staring out at the courtyard as he gathered his thoughts. Elira watched him carefully, sensing that whatever he intended to explain next required careful consideration on his part before the words would come. There are 7 territorial alphas who answer to my authority, he began finally, still facing the window. Each of them commands their own pack, their own lands, and to varying degrees, their own ambitions. Most have served loyally for years, respecting the balance of power my father established before me, but a few have always chafed under crown authority, viewing every decision I make as either a demonstration of strength worth respecting or a sign of weakness worth exploiting. He turned back to face her. Alpha Corvin Blackwood is chief among them. His territory borders mine to the north, and he has long resented what he considers excessive crown interference in matters he believes should remain within his own authority. If word reaches him that I released Ashwood territory from military action, based on evidence presented by a lone representative who cannot even speak, he may use it to argue that my judgment can be too easily swayed, that I lack the firmness required to maintain order among the territories. Elira listened carefully, understanding now the delicate political situation her success the previous night had inadvertently created. She wrote a question on her parchment. Would he act against you directly, or simply use this as an excuse to gain influence with the other alphas? More likely the latter, at least initially, Draven replied. Corvin is patient. He builds alliances slowly, waiting for the right moment to challenge authority, rather than acting rashly. If he can convince even 2 or 3 other alphas that my recent decisions demonstrate weakness, he could eventually gather enough support to challenge my position more directly, perhaps even calling for a formal vote of confidence among the territorial leaders. She frowned, writing quickly. Can such a vote actually remove you from power? Not easily, Draven admitted. The crown does not simply change hands through political maneuvering alone, but a sufficiently unified opposition among the territorial alphas could make governing extremely difficult, forcing me to spend more time managing internal political conflicts than addressing the actual needs of the kingdom. It would weaken my ability to lead effectively, even if it did not remove me from the throne entirely. Elira sat with this information for a long moment, understanding now why Draven had spoken of needing to handle this situation carefully, rather than simply announcing Ashgrove's betrayal and moving forward with restoring the treaty. The political stakes extended far beyond her own pack's safety, touching on the stability of an entire kingdom's leadership structure. She wrote another question, one that had been forming in her mind since he first raised these concerns. What would satisfy the other alphas then? What would demonstrate strength rather than weakness in how you handle this situation? Draven returned to his chair, sitting across from her once more, his expression thoughtful. That is precisely what I have been considering. Simply pardoning your pack and restoring the treaty, while true and just, might appear to some as capitulation to a clever presentation. But if I frame this decision differently, as the result of a thorough investigation that uncovered corruption within my own ranks, corruption that nearly led me to make a grave injustice, it becomes instead a demonstration of my commitment to truth and fairness, regardless of the political inconvenience it creates. She nodded slowly, understanding the distinction he was drawing. I intend to hold a formal council, he continued, inviting representatives from Ashwood Pack alongside the territorial alphas, where I will present the full evidence of Ashgrove's betrayal publicly. This will not simply be an announcement that the war is called off. It will be a demonstration that justice, however uncomfortable, matters more to me than avoiding difficult truths. Elira felt a flicker of hope at this plan, though she also recognized the significant undertaking it represented. She wrote her next question carefully. When would this council take place? My father needs to know. The immediate danger has passed, and my pack needs reassurance that the war is truly over. I understand, Draven said. I will send a formal messenger to your pack today, carrying word that the immediate military threat has been withdrawn, and that a full council will convene within the week to formalize the restored treaty and address the circumstances surrounding Ashgrove's betrayal. This should provide your father and your pack with the reassurance they need, while giving me time to properly prepare for the political complications that formal council will inevitably raise. She nodded, relieved by this plan, though she could not entirely shake the worry that had settled over her since learning about Alpha Blackwood and the other territorial leaders who might oppose the restored peace. Draven seemed to notice her lingering concern, studying her face carefully before speaking again. There is one more thing I must ask of you, though I understand if you feel this request extends beyond what you agreed to when you traveled here. She waited, curious what he intended to request. I would like you to remain at the Citadel through the formal council, he said. Your presence, your testimony, and the evidence you brought forward will carry more weight with the other alphas, if presented directly by you, rather than simply relayed through my own account of events. I know this asks a great deal, remaining here for the better part of a week rather than returning home immediately to reassure your pack in person, but I believe it would significantly strengthen the case for maintaining this peace against any political challenges that might arise. Elira considered this request carefully. Remaining at the Citadel meant additional time away from her father, from her pack, from the home she had left only 2 days earlier, expecting to return quickly, regardless of the outcome of her audience with the king. But she also understood the wisdom in his reasoning. If her testimony could help secure lasting peace, rather than a fragile truce vulnerable to political manipulation, the sacrifice seemed worthwhile. She wrote her response slowly, wanting to be certain of her decision before committing to it. I will remain, on the condition that regular messages can be sent to my father, keeping him informed of my safety and the progress of these negotiations. Of course, Draven agreed immediately. I will ensure a messenger travels to Ashwood territory every 2 days, carrying whatever updates you wish to send, along with confirmation of your continued safety and well-being. She nodded, satisfied with this arrangement, though the prospect of remaining in unfamiliar territory for an extended period still filled her with a mixture of anxiety and cautious anticipation. Over the following days, Elira found herself drawn increasingly into the workings of King Draven's court, assisting with preparations for the formal council, while also beginning to understand the man behind the fearsome reputation that had preceded him throughout her entire life. She observed him in meetings with Corwin and other advisors, watching how he weighed competing concerns, how he balanced justice with political practicality, how he carried the weight of leadership with a seriousness that belied his relatively young age. She also began to notice smaller things about him, details that the stories and rumors surrounding the Alpha King had never captured. The way his expression softened slightly when reviewing reports about successful harvests or peaceful territorial disputes resolved without conflict. The genuine frustration he displayed when discussing corruption or injustice. Frustration that seemed to stem from real principle rather than simple political calculation. The careful, deliberate way he treated every servant and guard within the citadel, never raising his voice, never displaying the casual cruelty that so many stories had attributed to him. On the 3rd day of her stay, she found herself in the citadel's modest library, reviewing some of the historical treaties between the crown and various territorial pacts, trying to better understand the political landscape she would need to navigate during the upcoming council. She had not expected King Draven to join her there, but he arrived mid-afternoon, settling into a chair across from the table where she worked, a stack of his own documents in hand. I find myself needing quiet space to prepare for the council as well, he explained, noticing her surprised expression. I hope you do not mind the company. She shook her head, offering a small smile, before returning her attention to the treaty documents spread before her. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the soft rustle of parchment and the crackle of the nearby hearth. Eventually, Draven looked up from his own work, watching her for a moment before speaking. May I ask you something personal, he said. You need not answer if the question feels intrusive. She looked up, curious, and gestured for him to continue. How did you lose your voice? If it is not too painful to discuss. Elira considered the question for a long moment before reaching for a fresh piece of parchment. This was not a topic she often discussed, even with those closest to her. But something about Draven's careful, genuine curiosity made her willing to share more than she typically would with a relative stranger. I fell ill when I was 10 years old, she wrote. A fever that lasted nearly 2 weeks, one that the pack healers could not fully explain or treat. When the fever finally broke, I discovered I could no longer speak. The healers believed the illness had damaged something in my throat, though they could never determine exactly what or why. They told my parents it might heal in time. It never did. Draven read this carefully, his expression sympathetic without tipping into the kind of pity Elira had grown weary of receiving from others throughout her life. That must have been incredibly difficult, especially at such a young age. She nodded, then continued writing. It was difficult at first. I struggled to communicate, to make myself understood, to participate in activities that required speech. But over time, I learned other ways to express myself. Writing, gestures, careful observation of others. I discovered that losing my voice did not mean losing my ability to communicate, only that I had to find different paths toward the same goal. That resilience is evident in everything you have done since arriving at this citadel, Draven said. Most people, faced with such a significant loss, might have become discouraged, might have relied on others to speak for them, rather than developing their own methods of making themselves understood. You chose a much harder path, and it clearly shaped you into someone remarkably capable. Elira felt warmth rise in her cheeks at this unexpected praise. uncertain how to respond beyond a small, grateful nod. "May I ask one more question?" Draven continued, seeming encouraged by her willingness to share. "Do you resent it? The silence, I mean. Do you wish, even now, that you could simply speak like everyone else around you?" She considered this question far more carefully than the previous one, wanting to give him an honest answer, rather than the simple reassurance others often expected from her. She wrote slowly, choosing her words with deliberate care. "There are moments when I wish I could speak, especially when urgency matters more than careful preparation, when a quick response could resolve a situation that instead requires the slower process of writing or gesturing. But I have also come to appreciate certain aspects of my silence. It has taught me patience. It has taught me to observe carefully before responding, to consider my words thoroughly before committing them to paper, since I cannot simply speak carelessly and correct myself moments later. I believe it has made me a more thoughtful person than I might have become otherwise." Draven read this slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I envy that, in a way," he admitted. "As king, I am expected to respond immediately to every crisis, every question, every demand for judgment. I rarely have the luxury of extended silence, to consider my words carefully before speaking. Perhaps that explains why Ashgrove's deception went unnoticed for so long. I was too busy responding to his reports quickly, decisively, the way a king is expected to act, rather than pausing to question them more thoroughly." Illyra had not considered this parallel before, but she found herself nodding slowly, recognizing the wisdom in his observation. Perhaps her silence, the very thing that had made others doubt her capability throughout her life, had actually equipped her with exactly the kind of careful, deliberate approach needed to uncover a truth that quick, confident speech might have missed entirely. They continued working in comfortable silence after that conversation, though something had shifted between them, a growing understanding and respect that neither had anticipated when Illyra first walked through the doors of the Great Hall 3 days earlier. On the 5th day of her stay at the Black Citadel, word arrived that Alpha Corvin Blackwood had requested an early audience with King Draven, arriving nearly 2 days before the formal council was scheduled to begin. Corwin delivered this news with visible concern etched across his weathered face, finding Illyra and Draven together in the library, where they had taken to working most afternoons. "He claims he wishes to discuss matters of border security in the Northern Territories," Corwin explained, "but I suspect his true purpose relates to whatever rumors have already reached him regarding Ashgrove's arrest and the circumstances surrounding it." Draven set down the document he had been reviewing, his expression shifting immediately into the careful, calculating demeanor Illyra had observed during their first meeting in the Great Hall, a demeanor quite different from the more relaxed openness he had shown during their recent conversations in the library. "Have him brought to the receiving chamber within the hour," Draven instructed. "I want time to prepare before he arrives." Corwin nodded and departed to arrange the meeting. Once he had gone, Draven turned to Illyra, his expression thoughtful. "I would like you present for this conversation, if you are willing," he said. "Not to speak, obviously, but simply to observe. Corvin is skilled at reading people, and I suspect he will attempt to gauge whether the recent decisions regarding your pack stemmed from genuine justice or simple manipulation. Having you present, calm and composed, rather than hiding away as though you fear his judgment, may help demonstrate that this matter was handled with appropriate seriousness." Illyra agreed, though a knot of anxiety formed in her stomach at the prospect of facing another powerful alpha, one whose reputation for ambition and political maneuvering had already been thoroughly explained to her over the past several days. They made their way to the receiving chamber, a formal, but somewhat smaller space than the Great Hall, better suited for private political discussions than large public gatherings. Draven took his position near the modest throne positioned at the room's center, while Illyra remained slightly to the side, close enough to observe but positioned in a manner that would not suggest she held any formal authority in the proceedings. Alpha Corvin Blackwood arrived precisely on time, a tall, imposing man with graying hair and sharp, assessing eyes that swept across the room the moment he entered, taking in every detail with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to gathering information quickly. He bowed to Draven with proper respect, though something in his posture suggested the gesture was more formality than genuine deference. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying the deep, commanding tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Thank you for receiving me on such short notice. I hope I have not disrupted important preparations for the upcoming council." Not at all, Corvin, Draven replied smoothly. What brings you to the Citadel ahead of schedule? Corvin's eyes flicked briefly toward Alira, taking note of her presence before returning his attention to the king. I have heard concerning reports, Your Majesty, that Commander Ashgrove has been arrested for treason, and that the planned military action against Ashwood Pack has been withdrawn entirely, based on evidence presented by a representative from that very pack. You have heard correctly, Draven confirmed, his tone giving nothing away. Forgive my directness, Your Majesty, but this concerns me greatly. Ashgrove has served the crown loyally for 6 years. To suddenly arrest him based on evidence presented by the very people he was investigating raises serious questions about the reliability of such claims. Alira felt a flash of indignation at the suggestion that her evidence might have been unreliable, but she kept her expression carefully neutral, trusting Draven to handle this challenge with the same careful precision he had shown throughout the previous days. The evidence was thoroughly examined and confirmed through independent verification, Draven replied evenly. Documentation of boundary markers deliberately moved, ledgers showing manufactured livestock disappearances, and a letter confirming payments received in exchange for facilitating land transfers to interests outside our kingdom. Ashgrove himself confessed to the full scope of his betrayal once confronted with this evidence. Corvin's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not having anticipated such a direct and confident response. A confession, Your Majesty? That does strengthen the case considerably, I admit. Still, one must wonder about the wisdom of allowing such significant crown decisions to be influenced so heavily by evidence gathered and presented by an outside party, however compelling that evidence might prove to be. Would you prefer I ignored clear evidence of treason within my own command structure, simply because it was brought to my attention by someone outside my immediate court? Draven's voice carried a subtle edge now, though he maintained the outward appearance of calm diplomatic exchange. I would think any ruler committed to justice would welcome such information, regardless of its source, provided the evidence itself proves reliable upon proper examination. Of course, Your Majesty, Corvin said quickly, recognizing the shift in tone and adjusting his approach accordingly. I simply wish to understand the full circumstances, given the significant implications for our kingdom's stability. If Commander Ashgrove could deceive you for 6 years, one must wonder what other vulnerabilities might exist within our current systems. An excellent point, Draven replied, and precisely why I have already initiated a comprehensive review of every border commander currently serving under Crown authority. This betrayal, painful as it was to discover, has prompted necessary scrutiny that should have occurred long before now. Corvin nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with this response, though Alira noticed his gaze drift toward her once more, studying her with an intensity that made her distinctly uncomfortable. And what of this representative from Ashwood Pack? He asked, addressing Draven directly but clearly referring to Alira's presence in the room. I understand she cannot speak. How exactly did she manage to present such compelling evidence without the ability to explain or defend her claims verbally? Through careful documentation and patient presentation, Draven answered. Her inability to speak has not hindered her capacity for clear, thorough communication. If anything, it forced a level of preparation and precision that verbal argument alone often lacks. Fascinating, Corvin said, though his tone suggested skepticism rather than genuine interest. Perhaps I might have the opportunity to review this evidence myself, Your Majesty, given the significant implications for our territorial security arrangements. All evidence will be presented in full during the formal council, Draven replied. You will have ample opportunity to examine everything at that time, alongside the other territorial alphas. Corvin's expression tightened slightly at this diplomatic but firm refusal to grant him earlier access, but he recovered quickly, offering another shallow bow. Of course, Your Majesty. I look forward to the council proceedings. If you will excuse me, I have arrangements to make before then. He departed with the same efficient precision that had marked his arrival, leaving Draven and Alira alone once more in the receiving chamber. Draven exhaled slowly once the doors closed behind the departing Alpha, his shoulders relaxing slightly from the tense posture he had maintained throughout the exchange. That went about as well as could be expected, he said, turning to Alira. Corvin will likely spend the next 2 days attempting to gather whatever information he can before the formal council, probing for any weakness he might exploit, to argue that this entire situation demonstrates poor judgment on my part, rather than commendable justice. Alira wrote her thoughts quickly, the anxiety from the tense meeting still evident in her rushed handwriting. Do you believe he will attempt to disrupt the council itself, or simply argue against the restored treaty during the formal proceedings? Difficult to say, Draven admitted. Corvin has never been reckless in his political maneuvering. He prefers careful, patient strategies over direct confrontation. I suspect he will attend the council, listen carefully to the full evidence presented, and then decide his approach based on how the other alphas respond. If he senses widespread support for the restored treaty, he will likely fall in line rather than isolate himself through open opposition. But if he detects hesitation or doubt among the others, he may seize that opportunity to push his own agenda more aggressively. She nodded slowly, understanding the delicate political calculations that would determine the council's outcome. Calculations that extended far beyond the simple truth she had presented that first night in the Great Hall. Over the following 2 days, as final preparations for the council continued, Elira found herself growing increasingly anxious about the upcoming proceedings, understanding now just how much rested on her ability to present her evidence clearly and convincingly before an audience far larger and more politically complex than the private meeting she had faced during her initial arrival. Draven seemed to sense her growing nervousness, finding moments throughout each day to check on her progress, to offer reassurance, and gradually, to share more of himself in return. Small details about his own uncertainties, as a relatively young king, still finding his footing among more experienced territorial leaders, who had served since his father's reign. I was only 26 when I claimed the throne, he admitted, during one such conversation, the two of them once again seated in the quiet comfort of the Citadel library. Many of the alphas who now answer to my authority had already led their territories for decades before I was even born. There are moments, even now, when I wonder whether they truly respect my authority, or simply tolerate it, waiting for the right opportunity to test my resolve. Elira found herself moved by this admission, understanding that the fearsome reputation surrounding King Draven Ashford masked genuine uncertainty, a young ruler navigating complex political waters while carrying the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives across his territories. She wrote a simple response, wanting to offer whatever reassurance she could. From what I have observed these past days, you lead with genuine principle, even when doing so creates political complications. That kind of leadership earns respect over time, even from those who might initially doubt it. Draven read this slowly, then looked up at her with an expression of quiet gratitude. Thank you for saying so, even if only through paper and ink rather than spoken words. Somehow, your written words carry just as much weight as anything spoken aloud might. She felt warmth spread through her chest at this comment, a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire nearby, and everything to do with the growing connection she felt developing between herself and this thoughtful, principled king, who had shown her nothing but respect and genuine consideration since the moment she first stepped into his great hall. As the day of the formal council finally arrived, Elira found herself standing once more in the great hall, though this time the space felt considerably more crowded, filled with representatives from across the kingdom's territories, each alpha, accompanied by their own advisors and guards, all gathered to witness the resolution of a conflict that had threatened to reshape the balance of power across the entire region. The Great Hall had transformed since Elira's first arrival, its usual sparse formality replaced by careful arrangements befitting a gathering of such significance. Long tables lined the sides of the room, each marked with the banners of the various territories represented, while the center remained open, a clear space before the throne where evidence would be presented and judgment delivered before the assembled leadership of the kingdom. Her father had arrived 2 days earlier, his broken leg still healing but stable enough for careful travel by carriage, accompanied by 2 of Ashwood's senior elders who had insisted on witnessing this pivotal moment for their pack's future. Elira had embraced him tightly upon his arrival, relieved beyond words to see him safe and to know that her efforts these past days had not been in vain. I am so proud of you, he had told her, his voice thick with emotion as he held her close. What you accomplished here, what you risked coming to this place alone, it will be remembered by our pack for generations. Now, standing beside her father near the front of the assembled gathering, Elira watched as King Draven took his position on the throne, his expression composed and authoritative despite whatever nervousness he might have felt about the political complexities awaiting resolution during the proceedings ahead. The 7 territorial alphas occupied positions of honor near the front of the hall, each flanked by their advisors. Alpha Corvin Blackwood sat among them, his expression carefully neutral, giving nothing away about whatever strategy he had settled upon during the 2 days since his private audience with the king. Draven rose from his throne once the hall had settled into expectant silence, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "I have called this council to address a matter of grave importance," he began. "Several months ago, tensions began escalating along the eastern border between Crown Territory and Ashwood Pack lands. These tensions ultimately led to military mobilization, with my forces prepared to march against Ashwood Territory, based on reports of repeated treaty violations and, most recently, an attack on my border patrol that wounded 2 soldiers." He paused, letting his words settle over the crowd before continuing. "I stand before you today to inform you that these tensions, this entire conflict that nearly resulted in devastating warfare between our peoples, was manufactured deliberately by Commander Ashgrove, who oversaw the Eastern Border Patrol, for the purpose of personal financial gain through illegal land transfers to interests outside our kingdom." A murmur swept through the assembled crowd, alphas exchanging glances with their advisors, clearly processing the significance of this revelation. Draven waited for the noise to settle before continuing. "The evidence supporting this conclusion was brought to my attention by Alira Vance, representative of Ashwood Pack, who traveled here alone, to present documentation proving that boundary markers had been deliberately moved, that livestock losses attributed to Ashwood Pack were manufactured through Commander Ashgrove's own orders, and that the attack on my patrol that nearly triggered full military conflict was itself staged, with my own soldiers ordered to provoke a confrontation that could then be used to justify war." He gestured toward Alira, inviting her forward. She stepped from beside her father, her heart pounding as every eye in the great hall turned toward her. But she kept her composure, remembering the lessons she had learned throughout years of communicating without words, remembering that patience and clarity mattered more than the ability to speak quickly under pressure. "Present your evidence," Draven instructed, his voice gentle, despite its public formality. Alira retrieved the documents from her satchel, the same evidence she had presented during her first night at the Citadel, now organized more carefully for this larger, more formal presentation. She moved through each piece methodically, first showing the original boundary map alongside the altered version, then the ledgers documenting manufactured livestock losses, followed by the account from the Ashwood hunter who had witnessed the markers being moved, and finally, the intercepted letter confirming Ashgrove's illegal financial arrangements. Corwin assisted throughout the presentation, holding up each document for the assembled alphas to examine, explaining the significance of each piece, while Alira gestured and pointed to highlight the most critical details. The hall remained largely silent throughout, the weight of the evidence speaking clearly for itself, much as it had during her first presentation to Draven alone. When the evidence presentation concluded, Draven addressed the assembled leaders once more. "Commander Ashgrove has confessed fully to these crimes, confirming every detail of the evidence presented. He orchestrated this entire conflict, willing to risk the lives of soldiers and innocent civilians alike, all in pursuit of personal profit through illegal land transfers that would have devastated Ashwood territory permanently." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled alphas before settling briefly on Corvin Blackwood. "I am restoring the original treaty between Crown Territory and Ashwood Pack, effective immediately. Additionally, I am authorizing reparations for the livestock losses and disruption caused by these manufactured tensions, along with a formal pardon for the Ashwood hunters who acted in self-defense against soldiers deliberately sent to provoke them." Murmurs swept through the hall again, but this time they carried a different tone, less shocked surprise, and more thoughtful consideration of the king's decisive judgment. Alira watched carefully, trying to gauge the reactions of the various alphas, searching particularly for any sign of the opposition Draven had warned her might arise from Corvin Blackwood. "Furthermore," Draven continued, "I am initiating a comprehensive review of every border commander currently serving Crown authority, examining reports, decisions, and financial records for any indication of similar corruption. Commander Ashgrove's betrayal reveals a vulnerability within our current systems that must be addressed thoroughly, to prevent such manufactured conflicts from ever threatening the stability of our kingdom again." Alpha Blackwood rose slowly from his seat, and Alira felt her stomach tighten with anxiety, anticipating the challenge she had been warned might arise. But when he spoke, his words carried none of the skeptical tone he had displayed during his private audience 2 days earlier. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, "I commend your thorough investigation and your commitment to justice, even when uncovering betrayal within your own trusted command structure proves difficult and politically inconvenient. This demonstrates the kind of leadership our kingdom requires, willing to prioritize truth over comfortable assumptions." Elira felt relief wash through her at these unexpected words, understanding that whatever calculations Corvin Blackwood had made during the 2 days since his private audience, he had apparently decided that opposing the king's decision publicly, given the overwhelming evidence presented, would prove more politically damaging to himself than accepting the restored peace with Ashwood Pack. Other alphas voiced similar sentiments, one after another offering their support for the king's decision, praising his thoroughness and commitment to justice despite the uncomfortable circumstances of Ashgrove's betrayal. The formal council, which Elira had feared might become a battleground for political challenges to the restored peace, instead transformed into a demonstration of unified support for King Draven's leadership. As the formal proceedings drew toward their conclusion, with the restored treaty officially ratified before the assembled leadership of the kingdom, Elira found herself overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and exhaustion, the culmination of nearly a week of tension and careful political navigation finally reaching its resolution. Her father embraced her once more as the hall began to empty, alphas and advisors dispersing to attend to their own territories, now that the crisis had been formally resolved. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with pride and relief. "You saved our pack, and you did it without a single spoken word." Elira smiled at him, tears of relief threatening at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them back, wanting to maintain her composure a bit longer, before allowing herself to fully process everything that had transpired over the past week. As the hall continued to empty, she noticed King Draven watching her from across the room, his expression carrying something that looked remarkably like admiration, mixed with a warmth that extended beyond simple political gratitude. When their eyes met, he offered her a small nod, an acknowledgement that seemed to carry more weight than any of the formal proclamations he had delivered throughout the council proceedings. Later that evening, after her father and the Ashwood elders had retired to their guest quarters within the citadel, exhausted from the long day's proceedings, Elira found herself wandering through the quiet corridors, still processing everything that had happened, still adjusting to the reality that the danger her pack had faced for months had finally been resolved. She made her way eventually to the small garden courtyard she had discovered during her earlier days at the Citadel, a peaceful space away from the formal halls and busy corridors, where a few late-blooming flowers still provided color against the encroaching autumn chill. She sat on a stone bench near a small fountain, watching the water catch the last light of the setting sun, allowing herself finally to feel the full weight of relief now that the immediate crisis had passed. She did not hear King Draven approach until he was nearly beside her, having exchanged his formal ceremonial attire from the council for simpler clothing that made him look less like the powerful ruler of an entire kingdom, and more like the thoughtful young man she had come to know during their conversations in the library over the past several days. "May I join you?" he asked, gesturing toward the empty space on the bench beside her. She nodded, shifting slightly to make room, and he settled beside her, both of them watching the fountain's gentle water in comfortable silence for a long moment, before he finally spoke again. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, away from the formal ceremony and political posturing of the council chamber. "What you accomplished this past week, what you risked coming here alone, it changed the course of events for both our peoples in ways that extend far beyond simply avoiding war." Elira reached for her ever-present writing materials, though she found herself pausing before actually writing anything, simply sitting with him in the quiet garden, appreciating the peace that had felt so distant and uncertain just a week earlier. Eventually, she wrote a simple response. "I am grateful you were willing to listen, even when I had no voice to explain myself beyond the evidence I carried." Draven read this, then looked up at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something softer and more vulnerable than the careful political composure he maintained during formal proceedings. "You have a voice, Elira," he said quietly. "It simply speaks through different means than most people expect. I have come to value that voice a great deal these past days, perhaps more than I ever expected when you first walked through my doors, mute and alone, carrying nothing but documents and courage." She felt her cheeks warm at this comment, uncertain how to respond to the genuine emotion evident in his words. She wrote slowly, choosing her response with the same careful deliberation she brought to every written communication. "What happens now? My pack's safety is secured, the treaty restored, the political challenges addressed. I suppose I should return home soon, now that my purpose here has been fulfilled." Draven read this, and something flickered across his expression, quick but unmistakable, something that looked remarkably like reluctance at the thought of her imminent departure. "I suppose that is true," he said slowly, "though I find myself wondering whether our conversation truly needs to end, simply because the immediate political crisis has been resolved." Elira looked up at him, her heart beginning to beat faster, uncertain exactly what he intended by these words, but sensing that this quiet garden conversation carried significance beyond the formal diplomatic exchanges that had characterized most of their previous interactions. The moment lingered between them, filled with unspoken possibility, before the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the corridor leading into the garden, breaking the quiet intimacy of the setting. Corwin appeared at the entrance, his expression tight with urgency, that immediately shifted the atmosphere from peaceful reflection to alert concern. "Your Majesty," he said, slightly out of breath, "forgive the interruption, but there is a matter requiring your immediate attention. The guards discovered an attempt to breach the holding cells where Commander Ashgrove is being kept." Draven rose immediately, his relaxed posture transforming instantly into the alert, commanding presence Elira had first witnessed in the Great Hall. "An attempt to free him?" "We believe so, Your Majesty." 2 men were apprehended near the cell block, though they claimed to be simple thieves seeking valuables from the Citadel storage rooms nearby. However, the guards found tools better suited to breaking locks than stealing goods, along with a hastily written note referencing payment for services rendered upon successful completion of their task. Elira felt a chill settle over her, the peaceful garden atmosphere shattering as the reality of ongoing danger reasserted itself. She had believed, perhaps too optimistically, that the formal council's resolution meant the immediate crisis had fully passed. This new development suggested otherwise, that forces beyond Ashgrove himself might still be working to undermine the fragile peace they had worked so hard to secure. "Bring the 2 men to the interrogation chamber," Draven instructed. "I want to question them myself before this matter goes any further." Corwin nodded and hurried away to arrange the transfer. Draven turned back to Elira, his expression apologetic but firm. "I need to attend to this immediately. Whoever hired these men to attempt freeing Ashgrove clearly has resources and motivation, extending beyond simple loyalty to a disgraced commander. This could indicate a broader conspiracy that we have not yet fully uncovered." Elira nodded, understanding the urgency, though she felt a pang of disappointment at the interruption of their quiet moment together. She wrote quickly, wanting to offer whatever assistance she could. "May I accompany you? I have experience examining evidence and reading truth from careful observation, even without the ability to speak during interrogation." Draven considered this for a moment before nodding. "Your insight has proven valuable throughout this entire ordeal. Come then, though I must ask you to observe rather than actively participate in the questioning itself, given the more sensitive nature of criminal interrogation." She agreed, and together they made their way from the peaceful garden back into the Citadel's more formal spaces, arriving at a small chamber near the holding cells where the 2 apprehended men now sat under heavy guard, their expressions ranging from defiant to visibly nervous. Draven began the questioning with the calm, measured authority Elira had come to associate with his leadership style, asking about their identities, their purpose within the Citadel, and the tools discovered in their possession. The taller of the 2 men, a wiry individual with calculating eyes, maintained his claim of simple theft, insisting the tools were meant for accessing storage rooms rather than prison cells. But the second man, younger and clearly more nervous, began to falter under the weight of Draven's steady questioning. Elira watched carefully, noting the small physical signs of deception she had learned to recognize over years of relying on observation rather than verbal communication. The way his hands trembled slightly, the way his eyes kept flicking toward his companion as if seeking guidance on how to respond, the way his breathing grew increasingly shallow as the questions continued. "Who hired you for this task?" Draven asked directly, his voice carrying the weight of authority that made even hardened criminals reconsider the wisdom of continued deception. The younger man's resolve finally broke. We were told simply that a wealthy patron wished to see the prisoner freed, that payment would be substantial if we succeeded, and that our silence was expected regardless of outcome. We never learned the patron's identity directly. The arrangements were made through an intermediary. Describe this intermediary, Draven pressed. The young man provided details, a description of a middle-aged man with distinctive scarring along his jawline, someone who had approached them in a tavern several days earlier with the proposal and payment arrangements. As the description continued, Elira noticed Corwin's expression shift, recognition flickering across his features. That description matches a known associate of several merchants operating trade routes through the southern territories, Corwin said quietly to Draven. The same territories mentioned in the intercepted letter connecting Ashgrove to illegal land transfer arrangements. Draven's expression darkened further. So this was not simply an act of loyalty toward a disgraced commander. This was an attempt by his southern associates to prevent him from potentially revealing additional details about their operations during further investigation. If Ashgrove's southern contacts feared he might reveal additional information under continued questioning, information that could expose a broader conspiracy, extending well beyond his individual betrayal, they would have strong motivation to ensure his silence, either through freeing him entirely or, more troublingly, through more permanent means, if freedom proved impossible to arrange. She reached for her parchment quickly, writing a concerned question. If they could not free him, might they attempt something more drastic to ensure his silence? Draven read this, his expression grave. That is precisely what concerns me. We need to increase security around Ashgrove immediately and expedite whatever further questioning might reveal about the full scope of this conspiracy, before his southern associates find another opportunity to silence him permanently. He turned to Corwin. Double the guard on his cell immediately. No one enters without my direct authorization, and I want a full report on any visitors he has received since his arrest, however brief or seemingly innocent those visits might have appeared. Corwin nodded and departed immediately to implement these instructions, leaving Draven, Elira, and the two guards still watching over the apprehended men in the interrogation chamber. Draven turned his attention back to the prisoners. You will both remain in custody while we investigate the full scope of this conspiracy, he said. Your cooperation in identifying the intermediary and providing accurate details will be considered favorably when determining your eventual punishment. Continued deception or withholding of information will not be treated with such leniency. The two men, recognizing the wisdom of cooperation given the circumstances, agreed to provide whatever additional information they could recall about their brief interaction with the mysterious intermediary. Draven instructed the guards to record their statements thoroughly, then gestured for Elira to follow him from the chamber. Once they had returned to the relative privacy of the corridor outside, Draven paused, running a hand through his hair in evident frustration. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that resolving Ashgrove's betrayal and restoring peace with your pack would mark the end of this crisis. Instead, it appears we have only uncovered the surface of something considerably more complex. Elira wrote her thoughts quickly, wanting to offer whatever reassurance and support she could during this unexpected complication. This does not diminish what was accomplished today. The treaty remains restored, my pack remains safe, and now you have additional information that will help uncover whatever broader conspiracy exists among Ashgrove's southern associates. Draven read this, and some of the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. You are right, of course. This is simply another challenge to address, not a reversal of the progress we have made. Though I confess, after the relative peace of our conversation in the garden, this development feels particularly unwelcome. She offered him a small, understanding smile, and for a moment, despite the seriousness of the ongoing investigation, something warm passed between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been building steadily over the past week, despite the political complexities surrounding their interactions. I should focus on coordinating the investigation into these southern associates, Draven said finally, though his tone suggested reluctance to end their conversation. This will likely occupy much of my attention over the coming days. I understand if you feel this changes your plans regarding when to return home to your pack. Elira considered this for a moment before writing her response. My pack's immediate safety has been secured through the restored treaty. If there is a broader conspiracy that could threaten that peace in the future, I would prefer to remain and offer whatever assistance I can, if you believe my presence continues to hold value during this investigation." Draven's expression shifted into something warmer, more personal than the formal political gratitude he had expressed following the council proceedings earlier that day. "Your presence has held value throughout this entire ordeal, Alira, in ways that extend well beyond simple political usefulness. I would welcome your continued assistance, though I also want you to know that your willingness to remain is appreciated, for reasons beyond the practical benefits it provides." She felt her heart flutter slightly at these words, understanding the deeper meaning beneath his careful, diplomatic phrasing. Whatever connection had been developing between them throughout the past week, it seemed clear that Draven felt it as strongly as she did, even as the demands of leadership and the unfolding conspiracy investigation continued to complicate any opportunity to fully explore those feelings. Over the following days, the Citadel buzzed with quiet but intense investigative activity. Draven coordinated with Corwin and several trusted advisors, working to trace the Southern associates connected to Ashgrove's illegal land transfer scheme, while additional security measures ensured the disgraced commander remained safely secured against any further attempts to silence him. Alira found herself increasingly involved in these efforts, her careful observational skills proving valuable during several additional interrogations of individuals connected to the broader conspiracy. She noticed details others sometimes missed, small inconsistencies in testimony, subtle physical signs of deception that helped guide the investigation toward more productive lines of questioning. Her father, though eager to return to Ashwood territory, now that the treaty had been formally restored, agreed to extend his own stay slightly, understanding the wisdom in remaining until the broader conspiracy investigation reached some measure of resolution, particularly given his daughter's continued involvement in the unfolding events. "You have found purpose here, beyond simply representing our pack's interests," he observed one evening, as they shared a quiet meal together in the guest quarters. "I see it in how King Draven consults with you, how he values your perspective on matters extending well beyond the original treaty negotiations." Alira considered his words carefully before responding with her usual written communication. "He has shown me nothing but respect and genuine consideration since I first arrived, Father. That is more than most people offer someone who cannot speak for themselves." Her father studied her for a long moment, something knowing in his expression. "Is that the only reason for the connection I have observed developing between you two?" She felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such a direct question about feelings she had not yet fully acknowledged even to herself. Her father chuckled softly at her evident discomfort. "I am not blind, Alira, nor am I opposed to whatever might be developing between you and the king, provided his intentions remain honorable, and his respect for you continues, as it has been shown thus far. Simply know that your happiness matters as much to me as the safety of our pack. Whatever path you choose to pursue, you have my support." She reached across the table, squeezing her father's hand gratefully, moved by his understanding and acceptance, even amid the ongoing political complexities surrounding their extended stay at the Black Citadel. As the investigation into Ashgrove's Southern associates continued to develop over the following days, uncovering an increasingly complex network of illegal land transfer arrangements extending across multiple territories, Alira found herself growing more deeply entwined in the workings of King Draven's court, her role evolving from simple pack representative into something closer to trusted advisor, her presence increasingly valued, not just for the practical insight she offered, but for the genuine connection that continued deepening between herself and the young king, who had once been nothing more than a feared reputation, whispered about throughout her entire life. Nearly 2 weeks after her initial arrival at the Black Citadel, Alira found herself reviewing documents late one evening in the library, working alongside Corwin to organize evidence that had been gathered regarding the Southern associates connected to Ashgrove's conspiracy. The investigation had revealed a network far more extensive than anyone initially anticipated, involving several merchants and at least one minor noble family who had been quietly acquiring territorial influence through illegal means for years, using Ashgrove as merely one piece in a much larger scheme. She had grown accustomed to these late evening sessions, often continuing well past when most of the Citadel's occupants had retired for the night, driven by an eagerness to see the conspiracy fully unraveled and permanently neutralized, so that lasting peace could finally be secured for both her pack and the broader kingdom. Corwin excused himself around midnight, his eyes heavy with exhaustion despite his determination to continue working. "I must rest, even briefly, before tomorrow's continued questioning," he explained. "You should do the same, Alira. This work will still be here in the morning." She nodded, though she remained at the desk a while longer after his departure, wanting to finish organizing one final section of documents before finally retiring for the night herself. The library felt peaceful in the late hour, only a single lantern providing soft illumination against the surrounding darkness, the crackling hearth nearby having burned down to gentle embers. She did not notice the figure approaching from the shadowed doorway until it was almost too late. A hand clamped over her mouth, muffling any sound she might have attempted despite her inability to speak, while another arm wrapped tightly around her, pulling her backward from the desk chair with startling force. Panic surged through her as she struggled against the unexpected assault, her mind racing to understand what was happening, even as her body instinctively fought against the restraint. "Quiet." A low, unfamiliar voice hissed near her ear. "You have caused significant problems for people with considerable resources, and even more considerable patience running thin. My employers would prefer you simply disappear quietly, sparing everyone additional complications." Alira's heart pounded with terror, but years of learning to communicate and defend herself without relying on speech had taught her resourcefulness beyond mere words. She drove her elbow backward with as much force as she could manage, connecting solidly with her attacker's ribs, causing him to grunt in pain and momentarily loosen his grip. She used the brief opening to twist free, grabbing the heavy iron candlestick from the nearby desk and swinging it toward her assailant with desperate strength. The blow connected with his shoulder, not enough to seriously injure him, but sufficient to create additional distance between them, giving her precious seconds to consider her next move. She could not call for help through voice, but she still had other means available to her. She grabbed the small bell positioned near the library entrance, one meant for summoning servants during normal hours, and rang it with frantic urgency while backing toward the door, keeping the candlestick raised defensively between herself and her attacker. The man lunged toward her again, but the commotion had already begun attracting attention. Footsteps echoed rapidly from the corridor beyond, guards responding to the unusual sound of the emergency bell being rung with such desperate insistence during the late hour. Her attacker, recognizing the changing circumstances, cursed under his breath and retreated toward the library's rear entrance, disappearing into the darkness beyond, just as two guards burst through the main doorway, weapons drawn and alert for danger. "What happened here?" one of the guards demanded, quickly assessing the disturbed room, the overturned desk chair, and Alira's disheveled appearance, her hands still trembling as she gripped the heavy candlestick. She gestured urgently toward the rear entrance where her attacker had fled, then began writing frantically on whatever paper remained within reach, her hands shaking so badly that her usually neat handwriting became barely legible in her haste to explain what had happened. "A man attacked me. Said his employers wanted me to disappear. He fled through the rear entrance when the bell alerted your approach." The guards read this quickly, one immediately pursuing the direction indicated, while the other remained with Alira, ensuring her safety, while additional alarms spread throughout the citadel. Within minutes, King Draven himself arrived, his expression a mixture of fury and barely controlled fear as he took in the scene before him, his eyes immediately finding Alira and assessing whether she had suffered any serious injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with concern as he crossed the room quickly, stopping just short of reaching for her, though every instinct in his posture suggested he wanted to. She shook her head, though her hands continued trembling, as the adrenaline of the encounter began to fade, leaving behind the delayed shock of having faced genuine, immediate danger. Draven's expression softened with relief, though the underlying fury at what had nearly occurred remained clearly evident. "Tell me everything," he said, gesturing for a nearby servant to bring warm tea to help calm her nerves, while additional guards secured the surrounding area and continued searching for any trace of the fled attacker. Alira wrote her account carefully, describing the man's ambush, his statement about employers wishing her to disappear quietly, and her defensive response that had ultimately allowed her to summon help before the situation could escalate further. Draven read this account with growing anger, his hands clenching at his sides as he processed the reality that someone had attempted to harm the woman who had risked everything to bring truth and justice to his kingdom. This confirms our fears about the broader conspiracy, he said, once she finished her account. Ashgrove's Southern associates clearly view you as a significant threat to their operations, sufficient to warrant attempted violence against you directly. This cannot continue. Corwin arrived shortly after, having been roused by the commotion, his expression grave as he absorbed the details of the attack. We need to significantly increase security around Illyra immediately, he said. This attack demonstrates these conspirators are willing to use direct violence when their schemes face exposure. We cannot risk another attempt. Draven nodded firmly, then turned his attention back to Illyra, his expression carrying a depth of concern that extended well beyond simple political obligation. I should have anticipated this possibility sooner. The conspiracy investigation has clearly threatened significant interests apparently willing to resort to violence rather than accept exposure and consequences. I will not allow you to face such danger again. Illyra appreciated his concern, though she felt a flicker of stubborn determination beneath the lingering fear from the attack. She wrote her response carefully, wanting him to understand that despite the danger, she remained committed to seeing this conspiracy fully unraveled. I am frightened, but I am also more determined than ever to see justice fully served. Whoever ordered this attack clearly believes I hold information or influence dangerous to their operations. That suggests we are close to uncovering something significant. I do not wish to retreat now, even given the danger. Draven read this, something like admiration mixing with his continued concern, as he studied her expression. Your courage continues to remarkable me, even in moments like this, when most people would understandably wish only to retreat to safety. But I cannot allow your continued involvement to place you at such risk without ensuring far more substantial protection than we have provided thus far. He turned to Corwin. Assign 2 dedicated guards to Illyra's protection immediately, positioned outside her quarters at all times, and accompanying her whenever she moves through the Citadel. I want this conspiracy fully unraveled as quickly as possible, so that such threats can be permanently eliminated. Corwin nodded and departed to implement these instructions, leaving Draven and Illyra alone once more, in the disturbed library, the aftermath of the attack still hanging heavily in the air between them. Draven finally closed the remaining distance, his hand reaching out tentatively to rest against her shoulder, a gesture of comfort and reassurance that felt entirely natural despite the formal boundaries that had generally characterized their interactions until this point. I could not bear it, he said quietly. If something had happened to you tonight, while you were here at my citadel, under circumstances that arose directly from your courage in helping expose the truth about Ashgrove's betrayal. Whatever happens with this broader conspiracy, your safety must remain the absolute priority moving forward. Illyra looked up at him, moved deeply by the genuine emotion evident in his voice and expression, emotion that extended far beyond simple political concern for a valuable ally or witness. She reached for her parchment one final time that evening, wanting to acknowledge the depth of connection that had clearly developed between them over these past 2 weeks, despite the political complexities and ongoing dangers that continued to surround their circumstances. Thank you for your concern, and for everything you have done to protect my pack, and now to protect me directly. I have come to value our connection deeply during these past weeks, in ways that extend well beyond the original purpose that brought me to your citadel. Draven read this slowly, his expression shifting into something openly warm and affectionate, the careful political composure he typically maintained finally giving way to genuine, unguarded emotion. I feel the same way, Illyra. What began as a desperate negotiation to prevent war between our peoples has become something I never anticipated, a connection I find myself treasuring more each day we spend together. He hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether to say more, before continuing. I know the circumstances surrounding our relationship remain complicated. You represent Ashwood Pack, and I hold responsibility for an entire kingdom's political stability. But I find myself hoping that once this conspiracy is fully resolved, once your safety is fully secured, we might explore what exists between us, beyond simply political alliance and mutual respect. Illyra felt her heart swell with emotion at these words, understanding that despite the danger and complexity surrounding their circumstances, something genuine and meaningful had grown between them during these past 2 weeks, something worth pursuing once the immediate threats to her safety and the broader conspiracy had been fully addressed. She nodded, offering him a small, hopeful smile despite the lingering fear from the evening's attack. And for a moment, standing together in the disturbed library while guards continued their search for the fled attacker throughout the Citadel grounds, the growing connection between them felt like the one certain, positive element amid the continuing uncertainty and danger surrounding the unraveling conspiracy. Over the following days, with additional security measures firmly in place, and the investigation into Ashgrove's Southern associates continuing with renewed urgency following the attack on Illyria, the full scope of the conspiracy gradually came into clearer focus. The minor noble family identified earlier, the Ravensworth family, had been quietly accumulating illegal territorial influence for nearly 3 years, using bribery, manufactured conflicts, and occasionally, more direct intimidation, to expand their holdings at the expense of smaller pacts and territories throughout the kingdom's border regions. Ashgrove had been merely their most recent and most valuable asset within the Crown's own command structure, but investigation revealed at least 2 additional officials, minor administrators within different territorial jurisdictions, who had similarly been compromised through bribery and promised land grants in exchange for facilitating the Ravensworth family's illegal expansion schemes. Draven worked tirelessly alongside Corwin and other trusted advisors to compile comprehensive evidence against this broader conspiracy, determined to ensure that whoever had ordered the attack against Illyria, along with everyone else involved in threatening the stability of his kingdom through such manipulative and violent means, would face full and appropriate justice for their actions. Illyria, despite the constant presence of her assigned guards and the lingering unease that remained after the attack, continued assisting with the investigation whenever possible, her careful observational skills and unique perspective proving valuable as the conspiracy's full scope gradually came into focus. The connection between herself and King Draven continued deepening throughout this period as well, small moments of genuine affection and mutual support developing amid the ongoing seriousness of their shared work to protect the kingdom from the Ravensworth family's illegal schemes. As the investigation approached its conclusion, with sufficient evidence finally gathered to formally charge the Ravensworth family and their remaining compromised officials, Illyria found herself anticipating the final confrontation that would bring this extended chapter of danger and uncertainty to its ultimate resolution, hopeful that once justice had been fully served, she and King Draven might finally have the opportunity to explore the genuine connection that had grown between them despite everything they had faced together. The final confrontation with the Ravensworth family began, not with dramatic conflict, but with careful, methodical planning that Draven and his advisors spent nearly a week preparing. Lord Ravensworth, the family patriarch, held modest but legitimate noble standing within the kingdom, meaning any accusations against him required irrefutable evidence to avoid accusations of the crown persecuting a noble family without just cause, a concern that Corwin Blackwood, ironically, had become one of the most vocal advocates for addressing properly, having fully aligned himself with the king's authority since the formal council 2 weeks earlier. "We cannot simply arrest Lord Ravensworth, based on the testimony of hired criminals and circumstantial connections," Draven explained during one of their late evening strategy sessions, Illyria seated beside him at the library table, now piled high with organized evidence spanning the entire conspiracy. "We need direct proof connecting him personally to the schemes, not merely proof that his associates and hired agents were involved." Illyria had spent considerable time reviewing financial records that Corwin's investigators had gathered, records showing unusual transactions between Ravensworth Holdings and various compromised officials across multiple territories. She pointed to a particular pattern she had noticed, payments that consistently arrived shortly before territorial disputes erupted in specific regions, always regions where Ravensworth family holdings happened to expand shortly after the disputes were resolved in ways that benefited their interests. Draven studied the pattern she indicated, his expression sharpening with recognition. "This is exactly the kind of direct evidence we need. If we can trace these payments definitively back to Ravensworth accounts, rather than simply intermediary sources that could be dismissed as unrelated coincidence, we would have sufficient proof to move forward with formal charges." Over the following days, working alongside financial experts brought in specifically to trace the complex web of transactions, they gradually built an undeniable case connecting Lord Ravensworth directly to the manufactured conflicts, the bribery of officials including Ashgrove himself, and ultimately, through careful investigation of the hired men who had attempted both to free Ashgrove and to harm Illyra, direct evidence that Ravensworth had personally authorized the violence against her once he learned his conspiracy faced potential exposure. When the evidence finally proved comprehensive enough for formal action, Draven moved decisively, dispatching a contingent of trusted soldiers to Ravensworth's estate, with orders to arrest the Lord and secure all relevant documentation before any attempt could be made to destroy evidence or flee beyond the kingdom's borders. The arrest proceeded without significant incident, Lord Ravensworth apparently having believed his schemes remained sufficiently hidden to avoid direct consequences, caught entirely unprepared when soldiers arrived at his estate demanding his surrender for formal questioning regarding treason, bribery, and conspiracy to commit violence against a kingdom representative. Illyra watched from the citadel's main courtyard as the soldiers returned 2 days later, Lord Ravensworth secured among them, his previously confident bearing now replaced by visible anxiety, as he recognized the full scope of evidence that had been gathered against him. She felt a complex mixture of relief and lingering unease as she watched him brought before the citadel. Relief that the conspiracy's mastermind had finally been apprehended, unease at the reminder of how close this man's schemes had come to causing devastating harm to both her pack and herself personally. The formal trial proceedings that followed extended over nearly a full week, with evidence presented methodically before a panel, including King Draven, several territorial alphas including Corvin Blackwood, and various legal advisors, tasked with ensuring the proceedings maintained appropriate fairness, despite the overwhelming evidence against Ravensworth and his associates. Illyra testified during these proceedings, describing the attack she had suffered in the library that night, connecting it clearly to the broader pattern of manufactured conflicts and illegal territorial expansion that the accumulated evidence demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt. Her testimony, delivered through her now familiar method of careful written communication, supplemented by clear gestures and unwavering composure, carried significant weight with the assembled panel, many of whom had grown to respect her contributions throughout the preceding weeks of investigation and political navigation. Lord Ravensworth's own defense proved weak against the overwhelming documentation of his crimes. His attempts to shift blame entirely onto subordinates and hired agents, undermined repeatedly by financial records tracing payments directly to his personal accounts, along with testimony from Ashgrove himself, who, faced with his own pending judgment, chose to cooperate fully with the broader investigation in hopes of receiving more lenient treatment for his own crimes. When the formal judgment finally came, Draven addressed the assembled court with the same careful, authoritative presence Illyra had witnessed during their very first meeting weeks earlier, though now she understood far more deeply the thoughtful, principled character underlying that commanding presence. "Lord Ravensworth," Draven declared, his voice carrying clearly through the formal proceedings, "you have been found guilty of treason against the crown, of orchestrating manufactured conflicts that endangered countless innocent lives across multiple territories, of bribing crown officials to facilitate illegal territorial expansion, and of authorizing violence against a representative who came to this citadel seeking only justice and peace for her people." He paused, letting the weight of these charges settle over the assembled court before continuing. "Your noble title and holdings are hereby stripped and returned to crown authority. You will spend the remainder of your life imprisoned, your influence over this kingdom's territories permanently ended." Ravensworth's face paled further at this pronouncement, though he offered no further protest, apparently recognizing the futility of continued resistance against evidence so thoroughly documented and testimony so consistently corroborated across multiple sources. Commander Ashgrove received his own judgment shortly after, his cooperation with the broader investigation earning him a somewhat reduced sentence compared to what his initial treason might have otherwise warranted, though he too would spend many years imprisoned, stripped permanently of any military rank or authority he had previously held. As the formal proceedings concluded and the assembled court began to disperse, various alphas and officials offering their congratulations to King Draven for successfully unraveling and resolving such a significant threat to the kingdom's stability, Illyra found herself finally able to exhale fully, the accumulated tension of the past 3 weeks, finally beginning to release from her shoulders, now that justice had been comprehensively served. Her father, who had remained at the citadel throughout the extended investigation, despite his initial intention to return home much earlier, embraced her warmly as the proceedings concluded. "It is finally over," he said, relief evident in his voice. Our pack is safe, the conspiracy fully unraveled, and you played an instrumental role in bringing about justice that extends far beyond simply protecting our own people. Illyra smiled at him, grateful for his continued support throughout this extended ordeal, though her attention kept drifting toward King Draven, who remained occupied with various officials and advisors as the final details of the conspiracy's resolution were addressed. It was not until later that evening, once the Citadel had finally settled into a rare, peaceful quiet following weeks of tension and investigation, that Draven found her once more in the garden courtyard, where they had shared their earlier interrupted conversation, nearly 3 weeks earlier. He approached slowly, his expression carrying a mixture of exhaustion and genuine relief, now that the extended crisis had finally reached its complete resolution. "May I join you again?" he asked, gesturing toward the same stone bench where they had sat together before the attack on Illyra had interrupted their earlier conversation. She nodded, making room for him beside her, and for a long moment they simply sat together in comfortable silence, watching the same small fountain that had provided quiet companionship during their previous garden conversation, both of them processing the full weight of everything that had transpired since Illyra's initial arrival at the Citadel weeks earlier. "It is truly resolved now," Draven finally said, breaking the peaceful silence. "The conspiracy fully unraveled, justice served, your pack's safety permanently secured through the restored treaty, and the elimination of those who sought to undermine it through manufactured conflict and illegal schemes." Illyra nodded, though she found herself hesitant to break the peaceful moment with written words, simply enjoying the quiet companionship after weeks of tension and uncertainty. "I have been thinking," Draven continued, "about what I said to you that night after the attack, about hoping we might explore what exists between us once your safety was fully secured and this conspiracy properly resolved. That time has finally arrived, and I find myself no less certain about my feelings than I was that night, perhaps even more so, given everything we have faced together since then." He turned to face her more directly, his expression open and vulnerable in a way that reminded her of their earlier conversations in the library, before political complications and violent threats had complicated the growing connection between them. "Illyra, these past 3 weeks have shown me qualities I never expected to find in anyone, let alone in circumstances that began with such uncertainty and danger for both our peoples. Your courage, your patience, your remarkable ability to communicate profound truth without ever needing to speak a single word aloud, these qualities have earned not just my respect and gratitude, but something considerably deeper." She felt her heart racing, understanding the direction this conversation was heading, though she remained quiet, wanting to hear the full extent of what he wished to express before responding herself. "I know our circumstances remain complicated," he continued. "You represent an entire pack whose interests must remain your priority, and I carry responsibility for an entire kingdom's stability and leadership. But I find myself hoping that these complications need not prevent us from exploring a connection that I believe holds genuine significance for both of us, if you feel similarly about what has developed between us these past weeks." Illyra reached for her writing materials, though her hands trembled slightly with emotion as she composed her response, wanting to convey the full depth of feeling that had been building within her throughout their shared experiences over the past 3 weeks. "When I first walked into your great hall, I expected fear and desperation, a single night to somehow save my pack from destruction through whatever means I could manage without the ability to speak. I never anticipated finding someone who would look past my silence to see genuine value in what I had to offer, someone whose respect and consideration would grow into something far deeper than I ever expected to find in a king I had been taught my entire life to fear." She paused, considering her next words carefully, before continuing to write. "I feel the same connection you have described, Draven. These past weeks, despite the danger and uncertainty we have faced together, have shown me a man of genuine principle, someone willing to pursue justice, even when it proves politically inconvenient, someone who has treated my silence not as limitation, but as simply another form of communication, worthy of patience and respect. I would very much like to explore what exists between us, whatever complications our respective responsibilities might present." Draven read this slowly, his expression transforming into open joy that Illyra had not seen from him before, the careful political composure he typically maintained, giving way entirely to genuine, unguarded happiness. Then perhaps, he said softly, we might begin by simply enjoying this peaceful evening together, without the weight of political crisis or investigation hanging over us for the first time since you arrived at this citadel. She smiled, nodding in agreement, and for the remainder of that evening, they simply sat together in the quiet garden, sharing stories about their respective childhoods, their hopes for their people's futures, and the gradual, comfortable understanding that had grown between them despite circumstances that had begun with such uncertainty and danger. In the weeks that followed, as the citadel gradually returned to its normal rhythms following the resolution of the extended conspiracy investigation, Illyra found herself dividing her time between visits to Ashwood territory, where her father had finally returned to resume his duties as Beta now that his leg had sufficiently healed, and extended stays at the Black Citadel, where her connection with King Draven continued deepening steadily with each passing week. The restored treaty between Crown Territory and Ashwood Pact proved remarkably stable, strengthened considerably by the formal justice served against those who had sought to undermine it through manufactured conflict and illegal schemes. Trade between their territories resumed, and even expanded beyond its previous levels, as both peoples recognized the value of the alliance that had nearly been destroyed through betrayal, but had ultimately emerged stronger through the truth that Illyra's courage had helped bring to light. 6 months after her initial arrival at the Citadel, standing once more in the same great hall where she had first faced King Draven, with nothing but evidence and unwavering determination, Illyra found herself now standing beside him as something considerably more than a pack representative seeking mercy. The formal announcement of their engagement drew celebration from both Ashwood Pack and Crown Territory alike, a symbol of the lasting peace and genuine connection that had grown from circumstances that once threatened devastating war between their peoples. As she stood beside Draven during the formal celebration marking their engagement, surrounded by representatives from both territories, along with the various territorial alphas who had witnessed the resolution of the conspiracy months earlier, Illyra reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had walked into this same hall once before, alone and afraid, carrying nothing but documents and courage, uncertain whether her silence would prove an insurmountable obstacle or simply another path toward the truth she needed to convey. She had learned, through that experience and everything that followed, that a voice could take many forms beyond simple spoken words. Patience, careful observation, thorough preparation, and unwavering determination had proven just as powerful as any speech she might have delivered, perhaps even more so, forcing King Draven to engage directly with evidence and truth, rather than simply being persuaded by clever rhetoric or emotional appeals. Her silence, once viewed by others as limitation and by herself occasionally as burden, had ultimately proven to be exactly the quality needed to navigate the complex political and personal challenges that had unfolded over these past months. It had taught her patience that proved invaluable during careful investigation. It had taught her observation skills that helped uncover crucial details others might have missed. And it had shown King Draven, more powerfully than words ever could have, that true strength sometimes lies not in how loudly one speaks, but in the unwavering courage to stand firm and communicate truth through whatever means remain available, however unconventional those means might initially appear. As the celebration continued around them, music and laughter filling the great hall that had once held such uncertainty and danger, Draven turned to Illyra, taking her hand gently in his own, his expression carrying the same warmth and respect that had grown steadily since that first fateful night, when she had walked through these doors carrying nothing but silence and unwavering determination to save everyone she loved. She had been given one night to persuade the Alpha King to spare her pack. She had not said a single word, and in that silence, she had found not just the salvation of her people, but a connection that would shape the remainder of both their lives. Proof that sometimes the most powerful communication requires no voice at all, only the courage to stand firm in truth, and let that truth speak clearly enough for itself. The Ashwood Pact flourished in the years that followed, their alliance with the Crown stronger than it had ever been under any previous generation of leadership. And throughout the kingdom, the story of the silent woman who had walked alone into the Alpha King's hall and changed the course of an entire war, without ever speaking a single word, became legend, told and retold as a testament to the fact that true strength often speaks loudest through actions, patience, and unwavering courage, rather than through words alone.